Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Greeting of peace. A very good day to all of you. Let me first of all take this opportunity to thank the organizer, particularly UNESCO and the University of South Africa, for allowing me to share my views on this very important topic of reimagining the futures of sustainable higher education towards 2050. This is indeed a topic that is close to our hearts, and all of us in higher education are struggling to find out what the future means for us, particularly given the pandemic. On that note, I would like to welcome you and thank you for participating and also contributing to this idea of the futures of the sustainable higher education towards 2050. Let me begin by introducing you very briefly my university, which is the International Islamic University of Malaysia, that is established in 1983, will be 40 years, 2 years from now. And this is a university that dedicates itself to higher education, particularly for the vulnerable, for the people who have not had an opportunity for higher education anywhere around the world. It is an Islamic university, yet it is not only for Muslims and the Islamic world. We serve the entire humanity, and we are hoping that the futures of higher education will be moving towards those directions. I would like to introduce you very quickly some of the credentials that the university has got over the last few years. We have been recognized by UNESCO for the UNESCO Chair of Future Studies on Anticipation for Sustainability and Well-being just a few months ago. Last year, we were awarded the International Award for Institution for Sustainability for the year 2020. And this recognizes the activities that we've been devoting ourselves to on sustainable development. Before that, we are humbly recognized by the United Nations University in Tokyo as a regional centers of expertise for sustainable development within our own region called the Greater Gombak. These are the three accolades that I would like to introduce to you to give you some confidence that the work that we are doing has been recognized and to a certain extent has also given some ideas of what the futures of the university are all about, which I will elaborate a little bit on this particular keynote that I'm giving you today. Let me try and give you the context of what the discussion will be all about. I think all of us agree that moving forward will be uncertain, ambiguous. Some people call it complex. Yeah? But these are the issues that I think we are all confronting, but none of us, at least not me, are prepared for this. And therefore, how do you go about in trying to find this balance into what we call this chaotic world? If we are unable to do that, the crisis ahead will be daunting. Added with the pandemic, we probably will not be able to deliver education the way it should be delivered, given all these other challenges in front of us and more challenges to come if you are not careful in how to handling the situation ahead of us. To do that, I would like to share with you what the university is all about. First of all, the vision of the university itself is quite unique. Unlike many of the universities that I know, here we talk about the betterment of human life and civilization. It is not just about the university, it is not just about Malaysia, it is not just about a community or a group of community, but it's also about humanity as such. And here I think the four keywords that is important to ensure betterment of human life and civilization are the word trustership, that is translated from the word Khalifah, also stewardship to a certain extent, the word trust or values of trustworthiness, which is translated from the word amana, and last but not least is the word knowledge, which is translated from the word ikra, that not only means recitation, but also reflection, translation, and also making things real at the same time. In other words, not just theoretical knowledge, but knowledge which has practical values for the relevant period that it is meant for. the Rahmatan lil Alamin, which means mercy to all. In other words, as I mentioned, it's not confined to any segment or any sector or any population, but it is directed to humanity as a whole, not only human life, but also non-human life and the environment around it, as the outcome of this leading the way that we are trying to forge as far as university is concerned. Yeah? For that, all of this must be seen in a perspective that is interrelated with one another, although it has its own sort of emphasis, but it has to be interrelated in another, so that at the end of the day, we can culminate it into what we call the value of education in our own context, and that context is what I use the word sejahtera in the indigenous terms of the word. The word sejahtera is about balance, is about harmony, is about fairness, is about equitability, is also about how to build relationship across whatever sector you are in. And it is not new, because in many society, in many culture, they have something which is equivalent. In Japan, they have the word ikigai. In Sweden, the word lagom means not too much, not too little, just enough in the context of balance. Africa has got the word ubuntu, I am because you are. Again, this context of relationship, creating balance, fairness, justice. And certainly, I think all of us understand the word yin-yang from Chinese, again, talking about balance and so on and so forth. In our part of the world, the Malay archipelago or the Nusantara, the word is sejahtera. And sejahtera will be the driving force as far as moving ahead in creating a future of education that has its own context within this particular part of the world that could then relate to other parts of the world, as I've just to demonstrate in different cultures and different sectors where the word sejahtera has got its own connection with its culture across human heritage. This becomes more important now with the pandemic, that this whole idea of living together across same value system, even the terminology may be different, but the values are the same. How then we can interrelate with one another and build education around it? In other words, it is not a false sort of a creation. It is almost an organic creation, because all of us have got the same values. Now we need to build around it so that we can interrelate with one another in a more natural and an organic way. So to do that, I think we need to understand a little bit of what this sejahtera is all about. It has three dimensions. At the first level, that talks about spirituality, the emotional dimension of the person, and all governed to an ethical dimension. And this ethical dimension is where the value are cast. That this ethical dimension will keep everything in its own sort of perspective, so that everybody will have a fair share and experiencing the same justice. In other words, we look at education in the context of sejahtera as a leveler of society as such. Built on this, then we will build the cognitive part, the intellectual part, and also the psychological part at the same time. This then adds to what I call the microcosm, the dimension that we need to educate ourselves within before we begin to educate anything around us. Until and unless we experience peace, until and unless we know what harmony is all about, it's just difficult to dispense peace and harmony because we have never experienced it. So the idea of trying to educate ourselves before we educate other people will be the fundamental values as far as the new education or the future education is all about, so that the balance between the mind and the heart becomes something which is real. Oftentimes when we talk about education today, the heart is not involved. It's very much an intellectual activity where the heart has no place at all. Suddenly, with the pandemic, we find that emotions becomes important, the question of mental health becomes important, and the question of heart becomes important. How do you bring this into the fold of the new education system is something that we want to understand and how to make it happen. To do this, I think we need to create this micro-balance, and this micro-balance will then allow us to function in the macro-balance, which is the world outside us, be it the ecological dimension, be it the economic dimension, cultural, and also the societal dimension. These are 4 dimensions that defines the macrocosm. We are supposed to interact, we are supposed to deliver, or in fact, we are supposed to learn from one another within this dimension. If we are not prepared for this, then I think we will not be able to deliver the best that we could. At the end of the day, we also want to see a kind of a balance, not only the micro balance, but also the macro balance. And this macro balance and the micro balance will be the final objective of what education would be like in the future. How do you maintain this balance between the human person and his environment? And this is where I think Sejahtera becomes into practice, how to make the balance becomes equitable as much as possible during the process of our lifetime. And that is what I call the Sejahtera principle of balance, which future education hopefully will address. If this is done, then we find that at the end of the day, we will be able to deliver many of the things that we have sought to deliver over a period of time. This is one example that I will share with you. In the year 2021, some of the achievements that we have made in trying to bring this balance into fore, in trying to make it relevant, in trying to convert it into something which is impactful rather than putting it just on a piece of paper as part of publication and so on and so forth. These are some of the highlights that I want to share with you that gives us confidence. If we push the way we want to push it, using the framework that we have created for ourselves, we will be able to make a dent as far as the education of the future in 2050 is concerned. These red dots that I have earmarked for you are some of the achievements that we've got, be it in terms of education, be it in terms of energy saving, be it in terms of looking at what the future is all about when you talk about your UNESCO chair and all the other accolades that we have got to show and to give us confidence that we are in the right track in trying to usher the new way of education moving forward using sustainable development as one of the pillars and creating a sustainable higher education towards 2050. Given the mission of the statement, the vision of the statement that I mentioned to you earlier, I want to demonstrate 3 things that is happening to us. Before I came into this university, one thing that we notice is everything is in a siloed form. These are an example of the 3 faculties or the 3 kuliah that we talked about, or rather the 4 kuliah that we talked about in university. They are almost on their own. They are not interacting with one another the way we want it to be, and they are almost in their own silos as well. What we did in the last 1 year, the whole of 2019, was to break the silos and to make sure that this university works together as a common platform in trying to achieve whatever knowledge we think it is necessary, not only for the university, but for the community around it. And this is what we call the Flagship Initiative. A Flagship Initiative is a platform for everybody to come together on the notion of what the flagship is all about. By definition, this flagship means a ship in a fleet which carries a commanding admiral, the best or the most important things owned or produced by a particular organization, in this case, our university. There are many things in the university that we are proud of, that we think we can share with the world around us, but we need to organize ourselves to make sure that this flagship really has a kind of a commanding position so that we can share with other people around the world. Perhaps it is difficult for us to understand the flagship in the context of what it is now. I would like to share what happens in the motor industry. A classical example is the Ferrari. It is a flagship, the Ferrari, for the year 1984 to 2013. And you can see for every other year, there is a flagship car as far as Ferrari is concerned. And what strikes me, not only they are consistently read, in other words, that's the brand, what Ferrari is trying to move forward, but every year when the car is produced, they are produced in limited numbers. They are not a mass production kind of a thing, where university tend to be now, and therefore, to a certain extent, losing its own sort of quality and its own sort of attraction as far as what the flagship means. So this is a flagship that we are trying to build, and over a period of time, I will share you some of these flagship programs that we are now able to push forward in trying to create what a future university would be like by the year 2050. Now, on that note, I think we've started to understand this flagship and use sustainable development goal as one of the driver to move it forward. Very early in the 1980s, we started to demonstrate this to some of these conferences, and this is the one that is in Malaysia in the 2019, the SDG Summit, and we begin to introduce the idea of flagship and how sustainable development works within this particular framework. To meet one of the mission of the university, which is mission number 2, that talks about balanced progress as well as sustainable development, we use then sustainable development as a key platform, as I've mentioned to you. Then in the year 2020, as we begin to understand sustainable development, suddenly we are struck by another unanticipated sort of crisis, which is the COVID-19, and I'm sure all of us know about this. And therefore, the flagship suddenly turns into something which is quite different. We talk about the flagship in the context of COVID-19. How do we actually move the flagship in trying to control, if not mitigate, and understand what this COVID-19 is all about as another challenge for us to move forward in terms of education. Suddenly, we are faced with lockdowns, not one lockdown, but many lockdowns to a certain extent, and I think all of us understand this, affecting our education system, the way things are moving, and in fact, the health status of our students, particularly in the context of mental health. This allows us to do many other things. Talking about physical distancing, I think we are one of the few universities around our country that talk about physical distancing right from day one rather than social distancing, because social distancing does not give us the impact of what physical distancing is all about, the use of sanitizers, and eventually the use of face masks. This becomes an added dimension to what the flagship is all about. How do you actually get into another motion of solidarity in trying to face this kind of adversity, maintaining what we call now the standard operational behavior so that we can also push away the COVID-19 infection as far as the population and the university is concerned. On that note, I think we are able to understand that the communities and sustainable development are moving together. And this is another chart that talks about the community is important in trying to get into a solidarity state, the bonding state, and therefore the concept of physical distancing is important vis-a-vis social distancing. Social distancing gives you another implication as far as the community behavior is concerned. And therefore, we use sustainable development once again to understand how people can work together given some of these goals that we have seen. Goal number 1, goal number 2, goal number 3, which is about hunger, which is about poverty, and which is about cleanliness and health, which is very fundamental as far as COVID-19 is concerned. And how this then adds on to the goal number 16, which is about creating peace, and goal number 17 is about working together as far as partnership is concerned. This will be then the framework that we are working to push or to change education moving forward in the year 2030 and beyond to 2050. As you can see in the last slides, I showed you an idea of what education is all about as far as we're concerned, but you can see that we have added on what we call SDG 18. Because on introspection, we see that there is another kind of bonding that we need to promote, which is what we call the spiritual bonding. And the university now is working on SDG 18. We hope that spiritual bonding will add on to what we call the physical distancing. Although physically we are apart, but spiritually, as human beings, as humanity, we are kept together through the spiritual sort of understanding and living, defending, and also caring with one another. So that is the flagship that we are creating for the year 2020 and beyond, in other words, in trying to understand how do we now work or at least, protect ourselves from this infection. There are documents that talk about how to use sustainable development to arrive at no one left behind. And this is again a document that describes very much the things that we do in trying to bring people together in understanding what the pandemic is all about. The other goal or the mission that we are talking about is about intercultural understanding and fostering civilizational dialogue. The year 2021 brought us another challenge when we talk about the vaccines. And therefore, the flagship turns itself into another sort of platform where we take vaccines into account as a mode of trying to control, if not manage, what the COVID-19 is all about. Yeah? That picture that you see in front of you now is a university organizing itself into what we call the vaccine center, where we invite population around the university to have their own vaccination free of charge provided by the university and the government at the same time. This becomes almost an automatic sort of contribution of the university to the community so that everyone in the community are looked after as far as vaccination is concerned. You do understand that vaccination has its own politics, has its own reality, where some people has got better chance of being vaccinated as compared to some others. The idea that we are creating here, what we call the high-touch engagement, is to make sure that everybody actually is vaccinated and not being left behind. And this is one of the platforms that allows us to actually create a solidarity among our university. And this is more important for me because suddenly during that particular period of time, we were inundated with heavy downfall. Rains for months on end, that some of the community that is now being left behind are also faced with another sort of calamities of floods and so on and so forth. We see people are stranded in many locations, and that adds on to the kind of solidarity that we need in terms of education. This is almost to me like a test of how functional this flagship is and how relevant it is when it comes to solving challenges that is unexpected. And I'm happy to report to you that our student responds almost like duck to water. Everybody takes their role going out to the community. We have to organize now buses, 700, 800 of them leave almost every day to the community around them to make sure that they are safe, to make sure that they are moved into safer places, and also to make sure that their houses are cleaned once the flood has subsided. And this becomes a routine activity almost for the 1 or 2 months that the student came back to me and reported, we learned a lot more when we work with the community in those state of affairs rather than staying in our library or our lab and lecture halls. These are things that we cannot get from the textbooks. And these are the things that I think we want because we become relevant as far as the community is concerned. In other words, our students are really prepared to move on the ground, given the flagship, given the kind of framework that we've prepared for them, so that at the end of the day, they become a positive contributor to the community, and hopefully this will contribute to what the future of education is all about. At the end of the day, we are meeting the last mission of our university, talking about deep sense of social responsibility among staff and students. And this happens because we have got another framework which is called the Sejahtera Academic Framework, which actually combines a number of things. Not only the mission statements and the vision statements that I talked to you about, not only the national philosophy of education that this country has got, but also it relates to other goals like the Sustainable Development Goal, like Education for Sustainable Development, like UNESCO 4 Pillars of Learning, or indeed the 5 Pillars of Learning with Learning to Become. All these are mixed together to create what we call the transformative, value-based future academic direction. In other words, IIUM has already prepared itself to realign with these major goals of not only meeting education for 2030, but also 2040 and indeed 2050 as we move on, where the entire student experience becomes an important contribution to the future of education, not only in terms of its theory, but also in terms of its experience and the practical being translating knowledge into reality. That has been our thrust for the last 3 or 4 years. That has been our move forward in creating what future sustainable higher education would look like. Given this framework, we're able to translate it into a larger plan, which is a scenario plan, and is part of the UNESCO Chairs for the Future, that we have now got our own image of where the university will be in the year 2040. So it becomes quite good for us that we have got Education 2030, we have got our own Education 2040, and now we are talking about Education 2050, all well realigned in trying to create what the future higher education will look like at the end of the day. Let me summarize what I have said in this one slides to understand where we have gone through given the experiences of the last couple of years. As I've mentioned earlier, we started with a very different kind of organization that is siloed, that is segmented, and have very little interaction with one another. And in fact, that is a starting point as far as trying to change the university moving into the future. What we did, therefore, is to identify what are the platforms that is necessary to break down the silos. And as mentioned, we work on an integrated, transformative sort of transdisciplinary platform so that people can come together and break down as much walls as possible and interact with one another. And for that, we also change the kind of evaluation that is necessary. It's no longer now the conventional exams, but exams could be something that talks about not just achievements of the end product, but more importantly, the development of thinking and also knowledge producing at the same time. Often there is no exams so that students can experience and understand what education and knowledge is all about. This allows us then to talk about how to move the university away from just the environment of the university. In other words, connecting ourselves with the community around us, be community engaged, and more importantly, trying to transform the community at the same time the university as part and parcel of one holistic community that is responsible for each other. And that requires another set of activities that moves us away from the comfort zone of just doing research and also acting on something which is very theoretical rather than with practical reality, solving real issues in real time. And this is where the whole idea of trying to create the kind of students which is quite different from what it used to be. We look at the students as a whole person that has different needs and different wants, and therefore different diversity that needs to be answered to, which is provided by the Sejahtera Academic Framework. And the academic framework is the one that drives the student into creating a new learning environment that at the end of the day not only talks about the impact factors, the KPIs as we call it, but also the impact on the ground, the real impact on the ground that we can really feel, touch, and sometimes see. And this is what we call the KIP, which is the key intangible performance. To quote Einstein, not everything that can be counted counts, but not everything that counts can be counted. I think often we have left that the KIP, the things that is counted, but because we can't count it, and therefore it just left on its own. We are trying to bring this back so that when we talk about a whole institution transformation, we are actually talking about as much as possible, not only the tangibles, but also the intangibles, including the attitudes, including the beliefs, including the values at the same time that adds on to what education would be about. And therefore, it is about connecting the dots. Not only connecting the dots within the university's environment, but also connecting the dot with other players at the same time, especially in the community. They have got their own understanding of what knowledge is all about. Often they have got wisdom that we have forgotten. And how do you bring this back so that we can humanize education? So that education is about creating better human beings, that we can live together in peace and harmony the way we talked about it in Sustainable Development Goal 16, partnering with one another, which is Sustainable Development Goal 17, and answering all the other goals that we are supposed to meet by the year 2030 and beyond. So these are the issues that I think we have been grappling with. And if we are able to do this, we are beginning to see what we call the whole society transformation. In other words, the university not only works for itself, but they also responsible in bringing communities together with them, and they grow together, as our mission has stated, betterment for human life and civilization, meeting what the university is intended for, not only for itself, but for humanity as a whole. So on that note, I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and I hope the little experience that we've got will be able to spark some ideas of where we need to move as far as education for sustainable development towards 2050 is concerned. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum and a greeting of peace.